Can you hear me?
Suara saya cukup terdengar ya, terima kasih. Selamat pagi teman-teman semua, terima kasih sudah hadir di sini. Selamat datang di diskusi publik Golkar Institute. Sebelumnya selamat ulang tahun Partai Golkar ke-57, tepuk tangannya. Semoga dengan adanya Golkar Institute ini makin menarik pemilih milenial, nanti pemilih Gen Z. Karena kita termasuk yang peduli tentang geopolitics dan juga climate change dan sebagainya. Dan untuk hari ini kita akan membahas Indonesia's leadership in the G20, post-pandemic challenges and opportunities, also the aspiration of emerging countries. Bagaimana kita menggunakan tantangan dijadikan peluang. Presidensi G20 Indonesia ini di tahun 2022 dari sudut pandang internasional. Selamat datang kepada Dewan Pembina Golkar Institute, Dr. Insinyur Bapak Airlangga Hartarto, Ketua Dewan Pembina, Pak Dito Ganinduto. Saya lihat di sini juga banyak yang hadir mungkin melalui Zoom. Mungkin saya langsung sapa aja, ada Pak Ludwig Frederick Paulus, kemudian Pak Agus Gumiwang Kartasasmita, Pak Zainuddin Amali. Dan yang hadir bersama kami di sini Dewan Pengurus Golkar Institute, Bapak Aceh Hasan Syazili. Selamat datang Pak Aceh, Ketua Dewan Pengurus, Pak Ferdiansyah, Pak Erwin Aksa, Bapak Rizal Marangeng, Putri Anita Komarudin mungkin bergabung lewat Zoom ya. Halo Putri. Kemudian ada Firly Hanggodo Ganinduto. And also joining us via Zoom are the ambassadors of G20 and ASEAN countries in Indonesia. Dan juga pemimpin redaksi media di Indonesia. Kami harap teman-teman yang ada di tempat di sini di Golkar Institute dan juga yang bergabung lewat Zoom dan lewat YouTube bisa memberikan pertanyaan kepada narasumber utama kita pada hari ini, yaitu Profesor Kishore Mahbubani, a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute National University, Singapore, the founding dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, also at the National University of Singapore, dan Dewan Penasehat Golkar Institute. Profesor Kishore adalah seorang diplomat Singapura dan akademisi yang baru-baru ini menulis artikel The Genius of Jokowi di laman The Project Syndicate. Jadi kalau belum cek, silakan cek, Google search, mungkin harus subscribe, it's okay, subscribe because it's worth it. Dan Profesor Mahbubani akan memberikan, ini hanya 30 menit lecture, but trust me, it's worth your time, 30 menit ini. Karena banyak sekali insights yang akan di-share mengenai geopolitical dan juga mengenai kepemimpinan Indonesia dan bagaimana kita bisa mengambil peluang di masa pandemi ini seperti yang tadi saya sudah sampaikan. Dan nanti akan ada waktu hanya 40 menit. Jadi mohon dipersiapkan pertanyaannya, nama, kemudian dari mana, pertanyaannya tolong dibuat singkat, tegas, dan to the point. Nanti kita akan pilih sesuai dengan diskusi flow-nya. Dan sebelum kita mulai acara hari ini, saya undang Bapak Airlangga Hartarto, Ketua Umum Partai Golkar, sekaligus Menteri Koordinator Perekonomian Republik Indonesia, untuk memberikan sambutannya. Bapak, the floor and screen is yours.
Izinkan saya buka masker. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Yang saya hormati Pak Sekjen, Pak Ludwig Paulus, Pak Agus Gumiwang Kartasasmita, Pak Jainuddin Amali, Pak Aceh, Pak Rizal Malarangeng, Pak Dito Ganindito, Pak Erwin Aksa, dan Ibu Andini. Beserta seluruh peserta Golkar Institute yang keempat ya, gelombang keempat yang saya banggakan. And Excellency Prof. Kishore Mahbubani, good morning and may be peace upon us. Honorable gentlemen and our very good friend Professor Kishore, who is with us from East Coast America right now, members of the board and participants of Golkar Institute Young Leadership Program, honorable guests and participants from all over Indonesia, which is watched through YouTube, Zoom, and Facebook, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce the topic of our discussion and our speaker today, my good friend and world-class strategic thinker, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. He is a friend of Indonesia, a good friend of Golkar, and who is also the board of advisor of Golkar Institute. We can also say that Professor Kishore is now the most well-known Singaporean in Jakarta. Several weeks ago, Professor Kishore wrote a sharp and thoughtful article, The Genius of Jokowi. This article was widely read, especially in Jakarta and other big cities in our region. He appreciated the role of President Jokowi, and he thought that Indonesia should be considered one of the most successful countries right now, both in maintaining democracy and keeping the economy under difficult circumstances. This is a very good and convincing article, and I could not agree more. It is a short piece, but with a very deep knowledge to what is happening in Indonesia in the context of our evolving world. In short, this article is a proof that Professor Kishore has a great understanding of Indonesia, its role and its potential in the coming years. But he also understands a lot more. Professor Kishore has written many books. Several of those are bestsellers. He has written about major issues in politics, diplomacy, development, and progress in Asia, and also about the West and its problem, and many more. He published his latest book last year with a clever and provoking title, Has China Won? Olympic proof otherwise. China lost to US in the Tokyo Olympic. This book was the talk of the day hotly debated and seriously discussed in the great university and think tank in Washington, D.C., Beijing, and Moscow. With his long writing career, Prof. Kishore is now regarded as foremost intellectual in Asia, a strong and thoughtful voice whose argument merits serious consideration and cannot be dismissed lightly by world leaders. He has enriched our understanding, not only our region, but also our contemporary world and its challenge. Apart from being intellectuals, Professor Kishore has had a distinguished and long career in foreign policy. He served as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations and held position of President of the United Nations Security Councils. As an educator from 2004 to 2017, Professor Kishore served as a Dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. With his distinguished background, I believe he will enrich our understanding about our topic of discussion today. We are lucky to have him with us in Golkar Institute. And therefore, on behalf of Golkar Party, I wish to express my deep appreciation to our good friend, the Honorable Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Now, as our topic today, let me make a brief introduction. Indonesia will hold presidency of the G20 as early as end of this month, till next year. A prestigious group of world's biggest economy, we are going to be the host of G20 meeting till October next year. A meeting of world's most influential leaders will be watched closely by people anywhere. So Indonesia has a great chance to set the agenda and persuade our friends regarding the best way forward in the post-pandemic world. We can also become the voice of emerging forward, a voice of friendly tones but with a clear objective, a voice of reason in a world increasingly tension of great powers which worryingly moving in the path that might be regretted by all. In short, we have to become the voice of humanity and democracy. We need to remain our friend, not to pursuing the fear nor hubris, but to embrace each other in the spirit of hope and common interest. Indonesia is now in the good position to play such a role. Professor Kishore has explained that in the context of leadership and democracy in the world today, Indonesia should be proud. We are the fourth biggest nation, a very diverse with many thousands islands, a place not very easy for anybody to govern, and yet, even under the darkest day of the COVID-19 pandemic, we managed to keep our democracy and our economy relatively healthy. Now we are embracing post-pandemic politics and economics. Our democracy will become stronger and our economy will grow even better. We have shown to the world that we have successfully done something many considered to be impossible in emerging world, to grow the flowers of democracy by embracing diversity, letting freedom bloom while maintaining order and democracy, as well as decency. In regard to our economy, the latest numbers are encouraging. We grew by more than 7% in the second quarter, and we believe that in the third quarter we can grow at about 4 to 4.3%. Toward the end of the year, year to year, we believe that we can achieve 4.5%. Yes, the pandemic hit us, but compared to what happened in most countries, we are blessed by resilient economy. Our record so far is among the best in Asia, and in terms of the rate of rebound after or during pandemic. If we continue this trend, the years ahead, Indonesia will become one of the world's biggest economy, 7th biggest economy, before we celebrate our 100 years of independence in 2045. The current mega trends going forward are the challenge of the net zero emission targets, which will be discussed in Glasgow, the disruption of global value chains in the vaccine supply, therapeutic, and semiconductors, The super cycle of commodity will challenge the high inflation and also in US, as well as the importance of maintaining the jobs as well as creating the jobs. So in short, we have plenty of reason to be optimistic in the coming years. The country is led by a good and visionary leadership, President Jokowi, and supported by majority people and majority party, including Golkar party. Without further ado, I now invite Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is also the voice of reason and optimism, our great and wise friend. Let us welcome him and give him a strong applause. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you.
Professor Kishore, let me introduce you properly and then also welcoming those of you who are just joining us through Zoom dan juga melalui langsung secara fisik di Golkar Institute ini. Sekali lagi saya ingatkan untuk memberikan pertanyaan, formatnya nama, afiliasi dan juga pertanyaan tolong dibuat singkat, kita akan pilih sesuai dengan diskusi flow. Dan Professor Mahbubani is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and also Dewan Penasehat Golkar Institute. Professor Mahbubani is currently live with us from New York and will share a public lecture on his insights of the current geopolitical issues in relevance to Indonesia's G20 presidency for Indonesia, Asia, and emerging countries, and also the challenges and opportunities for the presidency in times of post-pandemic economic recovery. Without further ado, Professor, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me.
Loud and clear, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that reassurance. First of all, let me thank Minister Airlangga Hartarto for that really generous introduction. I also want to thank Ms. Effendi for the kind words that she has said about me too. And I want to thank both Minister Hartarto and Ms. Effendi for referring to the article that I wrote in Project Syndicate. I had no idea that it would be the top trending article in Project Syndicate for many weeks. So it was read all around the world, not just in Indonesia. And no one challenged my claim, which is central to the piece which I wrote down there, that President Jokowi is the most effective, democratically elected leader in the world today. I know that's a very strong claim to make, but nobody challenged it. And so it shows that Indonesia is blessed today with extraordinary leadership that it should be proud of. And at the same time, it should be aware of it and frankly, not take it for granted. When you consider how so many large countries in the world are struggling, really struggling. I mean, let me give some examples. United States is struggling, it's badly polarized, divided. Brazil is struggling, and I can go on the list, but I would be more diplomatic and not mention too many countries. But Indonesia is very blessed. And precisely because Indonesia is so blessed with good leadership today, Indonesia has an extraordinary opportunity when it takes over the chairmanship of G20 next year. And that is the thrust of what I'm going to say to you in the next 30 minutes or so. Because I believe that if there's one country that can lift up G20 to a higher level than it has enjoyed in the past, it is Indonesia. And I believe that for two big reasons. One is that the G20 basically has been mismanaged and mishandled for a long time. And I'll explain why. And also, the Indonesia has a culture, which is deep-seated in Indonesia, which has actually been shared with ASEAN, which is the culture of musyawarah and mufakat, consultation and consensus. And that's what the G20 needs today very badly, consultation and consensus. And Indonesia, if we can export that culture, musyawarah and mufakat, can help to transform the world and not just Indonesia. So that's what I propose to explain, to say to you is my thesis. But to get there, I'm going to divide my remarks into 5 parts. In part 1, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the G20 and how it was created by accident. That's a very important point to know about the G20. And the second point is that even though the G20 was created by accident, it is actually a very, very important body, probably the most important body in the world today. And that's why Indonesian leadership would matter a lot. And the third point is that it is even more important today, especially in Asia, because of the US-China geopolitical contests, which are written about in my book, Has China Won, which Minister Airlangga also Artato referred to earlier. And then the fourth point I'm going to make, and the fifth point I'm going to make, is about the role that Indonesia can play with G20 and how Indonesia can transform the G20. And I hope that my remarks will be helpful, because clearly, as the Minister Airlangga said, I'm a friend of Indonesia. And in fact, normally I would wear a batik shirt, but since I'm in the United States, it's very cold. It's too cold to wear batik shirts here. That's why I'm dressed in a jacket and tie. But let me outline my 5 points now. And let me first of all talk about the origins of the G20. Now, the G20 was originally, as you know, it's a leaders' meeting. The leaders meet every year. It wasn't created as a leaders' meeting. It was created purely for finance ministers to meet to discuss international economic collaboration. And it was essentially started by 3 countries in 1999. It was the United States, Canada, and Germany. And there was a friendship between Larry Summers, the Treasury Secretary then, Paul Martin, the Finance Minister of Canada, and I think Mr. Eichler from Germany. And that friendship created a club. And then you would assume that, okay, that once they decided to set up the G20, that there will be a systematic process to see, okay, which are the most important countries in the world? How do we select them? And frankly, to be honest with you, there was a certain degree of arbitrariness in the way that countries were selected. And there was really no systematic formula for choosing countries. I mean, Indonesia would definitely be a member, right? As the 4th most populous country in the world, no question whatsoever. But some of the other countries were basically selected for regional representation and not necessarily also representing the most important economies in the world. So there was a kind of a haphazard process. And by the way, if today you actually had, if you wanted to work out a formula for assessing which country should be in G20, I've suggested that in one of my previous books, The Great Convergence, where I say that you should measure a country's share of global GNP to assess its economic weight and to measure its share of global population to measure its political weight. And then you should do an average of their share of global GNP and average of their global population. And then you'll get maybe a more representative group of countries. And so, for example, countries like, Bangladesh or Nigeria, which are heavily populated countries, should actually be represented also in the G20. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss that. That's something that will be discussed in the long term. But in any case, we do have a G20. And even though it's created by accident, it's actually, and this is my second point, is actually a very important body. And to understand why it is important, it is important to understand how the world has changed fundamentally. And this is something that I'm shocked that most people are not aware of, that the human condition has been radically transformed in the last 20 or 50 years, whatever it is. And what's happened is that the world has shrunk, and we have essentially become one world. And to explain that, I use something called the boat metaphor. Now, how does the boat metaphor works? Very simple. In the past, when 7.8 billion people, now we have 7.8 billion people on planet Earth, when they live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? Each boat was separate. And you know, by the way, in those days, the boats were separate because if one boat caught COVID-19, another boat would not get it because they are in different boats. COVID-19 will hit one boat, will not hit the other boat. But we know now how much the world has shrunk because now the 7.8 billion people no longer live in 193 separate countries or 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. This is the key point. All of us today are on the same boat. And that's what COVID-19 has told us. One cabin gets affected, all 193 cabins get affected by COVID-19. We're on the same boat today. So if you are all on the same boat, and if your boat is sinking, isn't it stupid? You just take care of your cabin. You take care of your cabin, the cabin will sink with the boat. That's stupid. But that's what humanity has been doing, taking care of their own cabins only. So clearly the world needs to come together to strengthen institutions of global governance in which we can handle the affairs of the world together. And frankly, there are, of course, many bodies that are established, the UN Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, and, we again discuss how they can all play a role. But the one body today that really can make a difference is the G20, because it is broadly representative. It does represent countries from around the world. And, if you look at the statistics, it represents 90% of the world's GNP, 80% of the world's population, and so on and so forth. So it is reasonably representative. So if it comes together, it can make a difference. And if you want proof of that, and this is a very important point, actually, when the United States created the G20, it wanted to keep it only at the finance ministers level. But then we had the 2008-2009 financial crisis, a major global crisis that began in the United States. And the United States was really worried that the United States economy would be hit very badly by the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And it realized that it needed to get a global stimulus. And fortunately, the G20 existed. Fortunately, the United Kingdom had a good prime minister called Gordon Brown. And Gordon Brown convened a meeting, I think in March or April 2009. He brought together the G20 leaders meeting. They agreed on a $1 trillion package, and Asian countries contributed also. China contributed $50 billion too. And as a result of that, the world was saved from a major global financial catastrophe. And that shows you how powerful the G20 is. When it comes together and coordinates, it can make a huge difference. And I would have thought that after the success of the London meeting, which saved the world, in subsequent years, the G20 would again come together whenever there's a major global crisis. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. And the G20 has mostly lost its way. And frankly, the fact that last year, when COVID-19 began, and COVID-19 affected all the 193 cabins, all the 193 countries on the same boat, the first thing we should have done was to convene a meeting of the G20 to say, hey, COVID-19 is a common enemy to all 193 countries. Let's come together, collaborate, and just as we worked together in 2009 to save the world from the global financial crisis, let's come together and save the world from COVID-19. And you know what? Millions of lives could have been saved if a G20 meeting had been convened. Millions of lives. But it wasn't. And this brings me to my third point. Why? Why didn't the G20 meeting take place? Because by early 2020, a major geopolitical contest had broken out between the United States and China. And the distrust between the United States and China was so great by then. And certainly, as you know, President Trump had launched his trade war against China in 2017, 2018. It had picked up momentum. The mood against China was so negative in the US, and no one even suggested, let's bring together the G20 leaders meeting. So an opportunity was missed in terms of saving the world from the horrors of COVID-19, which we have suffered. So it's important, by the way, therefore, to understand the US-China geopolitical contest and what's driving it. And this is why I wrote my book, Has China Won? And I want to emphasize one key point here, okay? This contest, US-China contest, is not about personalities. You know, if it was all about personalities, as you know, President Donald Trump is not considered a very nice man. President Joe Biden is a very nice man, a wonderful human being. Many of my friends are close friends of his, so they tell me he's a wonderful human being. But you notice that President Trump lost the election, President Biden won the election, a not nice guy went away, a nice guy came. The US-China geopolitical contest continued, didn't change. So it's driven by structural forces. And we must understand these structural forces. Now, of course, to understand these structural forces, I normally give a 1-hour lecture. Even 1 hour may not be enough. But I'll give you a very short 3-minute summary and talk about 3 structural forces that are driving this US-China contest. The first structural force, which is a 2,000-year rule of geopolitics, it is that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which today is the United States, United States would therefore try to push China down. Now, this is not surprising. This is normal behavior. In fact, there's a Harvard professor called Graham Allison who's written a book called Destined for War, in which he describes how this has happened so often in history. And he calls it the Thucydides trap and say that may lead to a war between US and China. I don't think there'll be a war, maybe except for the issue of Taiwan. There won't be a war, but there'll be rising tension between US and China, which is what we've been seeing. And so that's one reason why the G20 could not be convened. And secondly, the second structural force that's driving the US-China contest is the first one everyone knows and everyone talks about. The second one no one talks about, and this is the fear of the yellow peril. And it's important to understand that in the Western imagination, since the Mongols almost conquered Europe 800 years ago, there's always been this fear of the yellow peril. And it was shown when the US Congress passed something called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act of the 19th century. I mentioned this emotional dimension because if you want to solve a problem like the US-China geopolitical contest, you must understand the emotions behind it and not just the reasons behind it. And the third structural force, I'm going to mention again very quickly, and the reason why there is, the United States today, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is a very badly divided country. The Republicans and Democrats don't agree on anything, except when it comes to China. And when it comes to China, both Democrats and Republicans come together and say, let's stand up and be tough on China. And the reason for that bipartisan consensus, just to mention it very quickly, is that the United States believed that when the United States engaged China, opened up China economically, after it opened up China economically, China would open up politically, China would become a liberal democracy like the West, and then the US and China could live happily ever after as liberal democracies. But of course, that was a fantasy. But that was what was believed by many Americans. And this is confirmed in an article written by a senior policymaker in the Biden administration now called Kurt Campbell. He wrote an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs documenting that was the expectation. Again, so because the Americans feel disappointed that China hasn't become a liberal democracy, there is a bipartisan consensus against China in the United States. And I want to mention that this US-China geopolitical contest is a major global challenge because it is not just disrupting the people of the United States and the people of China, it's actually disrupting the whole world. Because if you can imagine, if I can use my boat analogy, and I'll say our boat is not that big, okay? And then if on the boat you have two big elephants, and the two elephants start fighting on the boat, the boat goes up and down. Okay? So that's what our global boat is going up and down because of two elephants, the US and China are fighting. Not fighting wars, but of course struggling politically and so on and so forth. So you can see that how in many ways everything in the world is all connected. The geopolitics, the geoeconomics, the health issues, they're all connected today because we are all on the same boat. And so it's important for us to understand our global condition and to understand why it's important for us to come together. And I haven't even, by the way, mentioned climate change yet. Two very important words that we should all be focused on, because it's very clear that unless the major countries come together and reach an agreement to cut down their carbon emissions, we will not achieve an agreement on climate change. And here I must say that even though many in the West just only keep referring to current emissions, we must also look at the history of who has been emitting the most in the past. And certainly if you look, the reason why global warming is happening today is not just because of new flows of global emissions from China and India and other countries. It's also because of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions that the Western industrialized countries have been putting up in the atmosphere since the Western Industrial Revolution. And so if you want to solve this problem, you must get the West to do more, and you must also get China and India to collaborate. And I can tell you that when President Donald Trump decided to walk away from the Paris Accords, it would have been quite natural for China and India and Asian countries to say, okay, if the United States gives up the Paris Accords, we give up also. I thought it was an extraordinary act of responsibility on the part of China, India, and the Asian countries not to walk away from the Paris Climate Accords. But that also is an issue that we must solve by coming together. And I want to mention, by the way, that one reason why the Paris Climate Accord succeeded is also because there was agreement among the G20. And as you know, there were discussions between President Obama and I think Premier Wen Jiabao, if I'm not mistaken, in Paris, that contributed to reclinching the Paris deal. And therefore, that shows you the importance of US-China collaboration. So that is our global situation today. If I can summarize what I've said so far, the world has shrunk. We have become one, humanity. We must come together and collaborate. But to collaborate, we need institutions to bring us together. The best such institution is the G20. And that's why it has a lot of promise. And as you know, the G20 was the one that saved the world from the global financial crisis. So if you look at it in terms of the problem is that we have to deal with a unified world. The solution is the G20. Then the next question comes, how do we ensure that the G20 succeeds? It's not going to be easy. Not going to be easy for the reasons that I gave, because everybody wants to take care of their cabin and the big powers are fighting. And in this context, trying to bring together the G20 is a challenge. So this is why I believe, and this is part 4 of my remarks, this is why I believe that Indonesia can play a very important role. Because Indonesia's biggest advantage, this is a very serious advantage. There are very few countries in the world today that are trusted by United States and trusted by China. Very few. You'd be surprised. And Indonesia is one of them. And indeed, I can tell you that when I did my interview with President Jokowi, I interviewed him before I wrote the article. I asked him a question about US-China relations. And this is what he said. I'm quoting what he said. That interview, by the way, was published in the Singapore Straits Times. And I think it may have been published in Indonesia also. He said, and I quote, President Jokowi, quote, both China and the US are two good friends of Indonesia. Indonesia wants a mutually beneficial partnership with the two countries based on international law. In addition to our economic partnership, Indonesia's relations with the two countries also aims to contribute to world peace and stability. And then he adds, given today's challenging situation, is this the right time for superpower rivalry? Question mark. This is my message to all countries. For Indonesia, cooperation is the best option. We are ready to be part of this. And I can tell you that the words that President Jokowi said to me are very wise words. This is exactly what the world needs. The world needs to see US and China collaborate to deal with the major global issues, including climate change and COVID-19. And I can tell you, for example, COVID-19 has so much damage to the world and to people. Do you know that we can save the world with $50 billion? If it's, for us, it's a lot of money. Actually, it's not. 8,000, that was 12, 13 years ago. If the world, China alone contributed billion. So contribute $50 billion in 2008, 2000. Today can easily contribute $50 billion. And you know what? If the whole world today spends $50 billion on vaccinating everybody in the world, the global GNP would increase by $9 trillion. That's a return of 180 to 1. That's an amazing return on an investment. And who can spend $50 billion? It's the G20. They can easily afford to do so. And that's why it shows you the importance of leadership of G20. So that's my hope, therefore, is that since Indonesia is the country, one of the few countries that is trusted by United States and trusted by China, that it should work very hard to persuade these two countries to press the pause button on their US-China geopolitical contest and say, okay, you may want to compete, why don't you do it later on? First, Let's fix the global problems. Let's fix COVID-19. Let's fix climate change. Let's come together to deal with the common threats of humanity. But not everybody can speak so frankly to the United States and to China. But the one country that can do so is Indonesia. And it helps a lot that you have that leader who's been in office a long time, who is supported by his own people, who enjoys a strong domestic standing, so he can speak with great authority, right? And that's a competitive advantage that Indonesia has. And I think that's the first and most important thing that Indonesia should be doing, to work as hard as it can through the G20 to persuade the US and China, please press the pause button and let's collaborate. And what's the second thing that Indonesia can do? And this brings me to the final part 5 of my remarks. You see, the great strength, the reason why Indonesia has succeeded in staying together as a country, even though it is so diverse. In fact, Indonesia is probably one of the most diverse countries in all the whole world, is because you have the slogan of Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unity in diversity. And frankly, the world, as we know, is a very diverse place. But Indonesia's ability to handle diversity is a great strength. And I want to say that, I referred earlier to Musyawarah and Mufakat. So what Indonesia needs to do is to inject the gene of Musyawarah and Mufakat into the G20 process and persuade the G20 countries that instead of coming to these meetings and doing grandstanding and giving great speeches and saying, my country is the greatest, no. Why don't you sit down and listen? Listen to what the other countries are saying, and then try and see whether you can achieve a consensus. And that's what's broken down in the G20 process. The countries don't listen to each other. In fact, by the way, not only do they not listen to each other, they can hardly meet with each other, right? There was no, as you know, President Trump refused to attend G20 meetings. So very clearly, the one lesson I learned, I was a diplomat for 33 years. The one lesson I learned, that if you can put two people who are hostile towards each other in the same room and get them to talk to each other, you make a huge difference. And I say this with great personal experience. When I first attended ASEAN meetings in 1971, among the 5 ASEAN countries, there was so much suspicion and hostility between Malaysia and Indonesia because of confrontasi, between Malaysia and Singapore because Malaysia and Singapore had separated, between Philippines and Malaysia because Philippines was claiming Sabah. So there was so much suspicion. But after 20 years, when I went back to ASEAN meetings, the suspicion had gone. They learned to get along with each other. And what happened is because Indonesia injected Musyawarah and Mufakat into the ASEAN culture. So just as Indonesia's injection of Musyawarah and Mufakat transformed ASEAN and made it the second most successful regional organization in the world, Indonesia can inject Musyawarah and Mufakat into the G20 process. That will change the chemistry of the G20 significantly. So this is the opportunity that Indonesia has. There is a massive global misunderstanding now. There is a major global institution, G20, that is ready and that can actually provide a solution to the global challenges we face, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's climate change. I can discuss overfishing, you can discuss deforestation, you can discuss all these things. But all these things, you can, if you need an institution to solve it, is the G20. So therefore, I hope, it's my sincere hope, that Indonesia will say, hey, we have a great global responsibility during our chairmanship of G20. We will do our best. And I know that if Indonesia does its best, it will not just be good for Indonesia, not just good for Southeast Asia and ASEAN, it will be good for the whole world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kishore. I think we lost you a little bit towards the end, but it should be good. Mudah-mudahan tadi semua bisa mendapat intisarinya ya dari kuliah Profesor Kishore. Siapkan pertanyaannya. But as the host, I have the privilege to ask the question to you first, Professor. So you mentioned that we are on the same boat, but I believe on a boat there's a deck, right? And then we are in a different deck. And with this COVID thing, what I see is that everyone is a man of its own, right? When it comes to vaccine, we know that the US has tons of vaccines. They basically hoard the vaccine, and it could be dispersed to countries that are needed, badly needed the vaccine, including in Indonesia. Yeah, they give away a little bit, but not as many as they should have, right? But China, on the other hand, they sell their vaccines. So, and I don't know whether it's an approach of international diplomacy in a way. However, it seems that we are not as one, as you mentioned earlier, to combat this pandemic. So how can we, Indonesia, be a middle person between these two giants that basically, I always call the US is, well, Biden in this case, is we have a term in Indonesia, udang di balik bakwan, gitu, you know. There's something, that tit for tat. There's a tit for tat with the US. It's always that. I give you this, but you got to give me something in return, right? So how can we deliver as a middle person when they both have an interest, they want something in return? I guess that's the point of my question.
Thank you. You're absolutely right when you say in our boat we have different decks. And I don't know how many of you know this. My parents, of course, migrated from India to Singapore. And once when I traveled on a boat to India from Singapore, luckily I slept in a cabin, but there were people sleeping on the deck in the open air, you know, because that was the cheapest way to travel. So in our world, as you know, we have rich countries and we have poor countries. And that's a fact of the world. And the mistake that the rich countries have made is that the rich countries thought that they were on a different boat. And the poor people were on a different boat. So don't worry about them. We are in a rich boat, they are in a poor boat. Now the rich countries are discovering, thanks to COVID-19, COVID-19 is sending us a very simple message. Hey, we are all on the same boat. Okay, you may be in different decks, you may have a nicer cabin, but you're still on the same boat. So even if you're in the nicer cabin, you still get COVID-19. And that's why I gave the figure of $50 billion. That is not a lot of money. You're absolutely right. We should be providing vaccines to everybody on planet Earth, and we can afford to do it. $50 billion is nothing. When you look at the defense budget of the United States every year is $750 billion, right? So can you imagine if you spend 1/15 of that defense budget, you actually protect the United States of America, because COVID-19 is borderless. It doesn't care what country you live in, it will enter your country, no matter what you do. So therefore, what Indonesia should do is something that I haven't spoken about, is the power of reasoning. You must appeal to a country's self-interest. Don't appeal to high ideals. Don't appeal to high principles. They never work in international relations. In international relations, appeal to self-interest. And so you must persuade all the rich countries that if they come together with China, India, ASEAN, and others, and collect $50 billion and vaccinate everyone in the world, then the rich countries will also benefit as much as the poor countries will benefit. So that's what I would do. And I explain why it is in the self-interest of the rich country to do this. And if you read my book, The Great Convergence, I also point out, and I give detailed descriptions in that book, it was a mistake for the rich countries to cut the budget of the World Health Organization, the mandatory budget. They should restore the mandatory budget because a strong World Health Organization is good for the rich countries also. So when I write, whatever I write, when I give reasoning, I always appeal to the self-interest of the Western countries, of the richest countries, and say it is in your self-interest to spend this money to vaccinate the world, and you'll be better off. And that's what I would do in response to your question.
Very well. We have questions coming from the floor here. Sebelumnya dari bapak-bapak, Pepe ada yang ingin bertanya? Oke, saya langsung saja. Ada Al Hadid. Al Hadid, please raise your hand. Where are you? Al Hadid, silakan. Langsung saja ke pertanyaannya.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity, Ms. Andini Effendi, and hello, Professor Kishore. I have a questions. What are the core challenges and opportunities that Indonesia faces from the US-China trade wars? And do you think if the condition remains, it will be headed into another Cold Wars, like in the 60s or in the 70s? Do you think that's gonna happen in the future or else? And that's all my questions. Thank you.
I think we're already in a war of narratives, right, Professor?
No, I actually think the US-China geopolitical contest, you notice I use the word geopolitical contest, is not the Cold War, okay? In the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union did zero amount of trade with each other. But China is one of the biggest trading partners of the United States of America. And you know, I'm talking to you on an iPad. I have an iPhone, right? And Apple actually is one of the most valuable companies in the world. It's an American company. But if China stopped manufacturing iPhones, Apple have to shut down. Okay. It shows you how interdependent they are. Amazing, right? So therefore, this is not the Cold War. This is why it's so hard to describe this contest. This is why I had to write an entire book, Has China Won? Because the US-China geopolitical contest is a very, very complex game. It is going to get worse in the next 10 years. I must emphasize that. It's not going to get better. But it will not be like the Cold War because, you know, for example, if the United States successfully isolated the Soviet Union, contained the Soviet Union, but United States cannot contain China because China does more trade with the rest of the world than United States does. And if the United States decouples from China, United States may decouple itself from the rest of the world because China trades a lot with the rest of the world. And you know, in the Cold War, the Soviet Union never believed in free trade. But today, paradoxically, China believes in free trade. China has joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and United States won't rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this shows you all the many differences between the current US-China geopolitical contest and the Cold War. That's why, if you have time, please read my book and you get a sense of the complexity. But you also asked me an important question at the beginning. What are the challenges and opportunities? That's what I heard you say. There are challenges, and I've described the challenges, but there are also enormous opportunities, especially for ASEAN. And if ASEAN plays its cards right, most of the ASEAN countries very clearly want to have good relations with the United States, and there are huge reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States in Southeast Asia, I must emphasize. I mean, if Americans go around the world, they find that Southeast Asia is one of the nicest places they can go to because people in Southeast Asia like the American people. And similarly, the countries in Southeast Asia want to have good relations with China also, because China has been our neighbor for only 2,000 years and will be our neighbor for the next 2,000 years. So you want to get along with a neighbor like China. And indeed, the trade between ASEAN and China has grown exponentially in the last 20 years. So clearly, there are challenges and threats for the ASEAN countries. But if ASEAN can stay united, and this is very, very important, if ASEAN can stay united, ASEAN can play a useful role in telling the United States and China, please, we want to be good friends with both of you. And also ASEAN can also reinforce the message that I hope Indonesia will send to US and China. Please press the pause button on this geopolitical contest. Let's come together and work together. And hopefully as a result of ASEAN being friends of US and China, we will get a lot of investment from the United States, we'll get a lot of investment from China, and those investments will help ASEAN grow and prosper. So therefore, I see not just challenges, I see enormous opportunities for ASEAN also in this US-China geopolitical contest.
Okay, continuing to that statement, there's a question from an anonymous. Can the Build Back Better World initiated by the G7 compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, Professor?
Yes, in theory it can, but you know, at the end of the day, it is not about launching initiatives. It's about putting up the cash, right? Because if you want to build infrastructure, right? I mean, as you all know, China is working with Indonesia to build the Jakarta-Bandung Railway. Now, if you want to build the Jakarta-Bandung Railway, you can express it as a good idea, or you can say, okay, I will invest in it, I will share my technology with you, I will help train your engineers, and I will help construct it. Then you get a railway. But if you get a build better, sorry, I can't remember the word, build back better world, if there's no cash on the table, if there are no resources on the table, then it's very hard. And here the tragedy is this. This is a very delicate point I'm making. I'm now in the United States, okay? And you know, my children are here, and I've been driving around. Yesterday I drove 6 hours from Pittsburgh to New Jersey. And the roads and bridges in the United States, even the American Society of Civil Engineers has said many of the roads and bridges are below par. And as you know, the United States has no fast trains at all. And China has built thousands and thousands of kilometers of fast trains. So when it comes to infrastructure, it's not just what the words you're doing. You got to show that you yourself can build world-class infrastructure. And that is basically China's competitive strength today, that it has built world-class infrastructure. It is sharing its technology with the rest of the world. And it's on a voluntary basis. For the Belt and Road Initiative, you can either choose not to join. So United States hasn't joined, Japan hasn't joined, India hasn't joined, Australia hasn't joined. That's okay. But out of the 193 countries, 130 countries have joined. So it shows you that when countries are offered concrete projects that can improve their countries, they'll consider it and they'll join it. So the Build Back Better World doesn't have any resources to match the initiative yet. And frankly, we will be better off in the area of infrastructure to have US and China cooperate with each other to build infrastructure for the world instead of competing with each other. And that could be a win-win formula, which I hope Indonesia can suggest as part of its G20 chairmanship next year.
Very well. Jane Francis, dari floor, Jane Francis, Dr. Jane Francis, silakan. Langsung saja ke pertanyaannya, Jane.
Thank you for the opportunity, Professor Kishore. My name is Jane. I am the founder of Defense Heritage Society. I would like to ask about how to, in the G20 presidency, how to make Indonesia the country of research, not just in economic aspect, but also how we can be the country of research. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Professor.
You said country of research, right?
Correct.
Research. Yes, yeah. Well, I think certainly there'll be, when you become chairman of G20, the good news is that I'm going to give you a big secret now, okay? Lots of countries will come and court you for 1 year. You'll be the most attractive woman in the room when you're chairman of G20. So everybody will come courting you and talking to you, and so this creates tremendous opportunities. So for example, I agree that on many G20 projects, especially on global governance issues, Indonesia can do joint research projects with many other countries, because ideas, good ideas, have no borders. They don't stay in a country. Good ideas are borderless. So when it comes to research, the best kind of research is through international collaboration. And in fact, I can tell you from Singapore's experience, when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, when I recruited professors at the Lee Kuan Yew School, I didn't just look for Singaporeans. I mean, of course, we had half the professors from Singapore, but half the professors, I said, we must go and find the best professors around the world and get them to teach in the Lee Kuan Yew School. So good research ideas can be found all around the world. So I would say certainly use that 1 year as chairman of G20, take advantage of these opportunities and engage in as many collaborative efforts as you can, because for 1 year, everybody will be knocking on Indonesia's door.
Jane, maybe you should start in Singapore and bring back that to Indonesia. Ya. Jerry, penanya berikutnya. Jerry, silakan. Jerry, langsung ke pertanyaannya ya.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Gary. I'm from Jambi, Indonesia. My question: what's your interview earlier? And you keep saying that we Indonesia should learn from Vietnam. What can we learn from Vietnam that they done 20 or 10 years ago that we don't? Exactly. Can you elaborate on that? Thank you, Professor.
Very, very good question. If you look at countries around the world, one country that should not have succeeded should have been Vietnam, because Vietnam had been at war for almost continuously for over 50 years, from 1940 right until 1990, right? 50 years. First they fought the French, and then they fought the Americans, and then they fought the Chinese, and they were constantly at war. So when the war suddenly ended in 1990, and you look, by the way, it's another example in the Cold War, a country like Cuba that was very close to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cuban economy suffered. Vietnam's economy could have suffered. So instead of the Vietnam's economy collapsing at the end of the Cold War, Vietnam's economy soared amazingly. And what did Vietnam do? Vietnam went to learn from all the countries in the world. Okay? And I can tell you that, this, I'll be very frank with you. In 1985, when I was Singapore's ambassador to the UN, the Singapore diplomat and the Vietnamese diplomat used to fight each other over the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. We used to fight very, very hard. That was 1985. The Cold War ended 1990. 6-7 years later, by the early 1990s, Vietnamese were sending delegations to Singapore to learn from Singapore, right? And they invited Mr. Lee Kuan Yew to go to Vietnam so they can learn lessons from Singapore. So they built industrial parks, they switched to exports. And Vietnam's record in poverty reduction is one of the best in human history ever. It's an amazing country, Vietnam. So I'm not just saying don't just learn from Vietnam alone, but learn from all the successful countries in the world. And that's how Singapore succeeded. Singapore succeeded because Singapore copied from all countries in the world. It's free of charge. You can copy any ideas. I keep saying ideas are borderless, okay? Good ideas are everywhere. So that's what the Vietnam succeeded by copying from the rest of the world. Singapore succeeded by copying from the rest of the world. Any country can succeed by copying from the world. And that's the lesson from Vietnam.
Professor, I think also with Vietnam case, I believe they're like in the top 3, if not number 1, in terms of renewable energy in ASEAN countries. Whereas Indonesia has a lot of sources, but Vietnam has a strong policies to support that. I guess that's also not only ideas that they have, but they actually execute to be ahead.
That's right.
Right? Okay, very well. Next is Herwanto. Herwanto, silakan. Langsung saya pertanyaannya ya.
Thank you for opportunity. My name is Harwanto. My question is, what are the real impact for Indonesia about G20, especially for micro business in Indonesia? Because in Indonesia, many micro business are crying because of COVID-19. Thank you.
So your question is about how small and micro businesses can flourish.
Micro business in Indonesia impact.
Okay,
yes.
During Indonesia's G20 presidency, how the small and micro businesses can flourish when we hold the presidency. Because our economy basically based on that. Benar ya Pak ya Erlang? Ya betul. Ya silakan. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, in the case of micro businesses are affected by the microeconomic environment and the macroeconomic environment. So micro businesses are affected by what's happening in your town, in your village, but it's also affected by the global economy also. And so if the G20 can come together and collaborate, for example, in spending $50 billion, right, in vaccinating the world, and if the $50 billion is spent and the global economy grows by $9 trillion, there's no question that that will also boost economic growth in Indonesia, for sure. So therefore, that's why if under Indonesia's leadership, if Indonesia can push this idea, by the way, this idea is not mine. It's been pushed by IMF, it's been pushed by the G30 group, it's been pushed by Martin Wolf of Financial Times. So if this one idea, if Indonesia can say, let's spend $50 billion, let's vaccinate the world, and then the global economic boom that would follow will benefit all the countries in the world and benefit Indonesia and also benefit small and medium-sized enterprises, because small and medium-sized enterprises are not just affected by what's happening inside in your immediate neighborhood, it's also affected by the global world economy. I think that's how Indonesia can boost SMEs.
Saiful Rahmat di sini. Silakan, Saiful. Langsung pertanyaannya.
Check. Thank you for attention. Mister, I have the question. Is how to G20 can take care of local wisdom? Check. And then how to civil society can access the open market? Thank you.
So the first question is, can you repeat that again, please?
Yes. How to G20 can take care of local wisdom?
Local wisdom.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Local. And number 2, how to civil society can access the open market?
How can civil society access the open market?
Yes.
Under the G20 presidency?
Thank you.
Professor.
Well, I'll make 2 points very quickly. One is in terms of local wisdom. I haven't mentioned this word so far. I haven't mentioned Pancasila. And I actually think that, as you know, Pancasila has been good for Indonesia, but the spirit of Pancasila can also be injected into the G20 And as you know, the concept of unity in diversity is in many ways a spin-off from Pancasila. And just as you had the famous 1955 Bandung meeting, which, by the way, was a very important meeting. The 1955 Bandung meeting gave a boost of self-confidence to the developing countries of the world in 1955, I believe. So in the same way, you can inject a new Bandung spirit into the G20 and again inject a new burst of self-confidence in the world through the G20 process, again emphasizing unity in diversity for the whole world. And that's, I would say, that's how I would use the local wisdom. Now, in the case of civil society, it is a fact that whenever a G20 meeting takes place, a lot of civil society organizations come and start lobbying the G20 countries and also start lobbying the G20 processes. So you will see lots of civil society organizations from all over the world come to Indonesia during Indonesia's G20 chairmanship. And I would use that opportunity to build links between civil society in Indonesia and civil society in the rest of the world.
Okay, we have Fitri from Aceh. Mbak Fitri. Fitri dari Aceh yang di sini, silakan tunjuk tangannya. Oh, silakan, langsung pertanyaannya ya.
1, 2. Alright, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
I am Fitri, I am from Aceh. I have 2 questions actually. The first for Professor Kishore and the second one for Mr. Erlangga Hartarto. I hope you as the chairman of board today, you can answer our question later. Alright, dear Professor Kishore, what strategic position should, as a young, we take a position that can be mutual and can support each other or interdependent with the government in this G20 event. And I hope we as the young can take part for this opportunity. Dan, as the young generation. And my second question for my chairman of board today, Mr. Erlangga Hartarto. Pak Erlangga, bolehkah kami pemuda Indonesia sebagai alumni dari Golkar Institute ini mengambil peran dalam momentum presidensi G20 ini? Jika boleh Pak, kami ingin diberi ruang untuk berpartisipasi dan berkolaborasi dalam rangkaian kegiatan forum G20 yang nanti akan dilaksanakan di Indonesia. Karena insya Allah kami siap membantu. I want to translate my second question to Professor Kishore, to Mr. Erlangga. Can we young as Golkar Institute alumni take part in this G20 presidency momentum? If possible, we would like to be given space to participate and collaborate in a series of activities for the G20, from which will be held in Indonesia, and we are ready to help. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you get the first and the last question, Professor. How can the young generation partake the G20 presidency?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important contribution that the young generation can make is to emphasize that if the current generation, my generation, doesn't take care of climate change, the people, my generation is not going to suffer. You know, I'm 73 years old, I may be around another 20 years. I will not suffer from climate change. But the young people, the young lady who asked me the question, she's going to be around 70, 80, 90 years from now. And she will suffer the consequences of climate change. Now, the problem is that very few young people today are speaking out and saying, why are you ruining my future? Why are you creating a world where I will suffer the consequences? You know, whether it's global warming, whether it's deforestation, whether it's, uninhabitable environments, So my generation is being very irresponsible. But we don't have to worry because we don't suffer the consequences of climate change. But her generation, the young lady generation, will suffer. So it's important for the young in Indonesia also to speak out very strongly against the countries that are refusing to fulfill their commitments to climate change. And I can tell you, unfortunately, including some of the, some of the highest per capita emissions from the richest countries like Canada and Australia. I mean, the data, you can check the data. And yet, the young countries are not writing letters to Canada and Australia and saying, maybe you should do a bit more to fight climate change. So that's what the young people should be doing, should be to try and understand the nature of the problem and then appeal to countries, appeal to young people around the world to come together to fight climate change. And that's one thing I would encourage the young in Indonesia to do.
Silakan Pak Erlangga.
Fitri, Fitri, I think there are engagement group that we call Youth 20. So I think the alumni of G20 can discuss in the forum of Youth 20. So I think that's can be arranged for the discussion. And the second is the issue of megatrend that the youth has to be competent on that. So the issue, megatrend is, as Prof. Kishore said, about the environments, about understanding about net zero emission, the Indonesian target, along with others. And second is, of course, about the creating and protecting jobs that in Indonesia is important on the global value chains, an issue of US as well in today's world. The global tension between US and China is becoming the disruption of the global value chain. So this is an opportunity for Indonesia, especially on the digitalization. Is only a semiconductor is a new commodity. Thank you.
Kayaknya kita ngelihat calon caleg Pak dari Aceh, Nanggro Aceh Darussalam, caleg Golkar. Okay, we have a question from Zoom, Salwa Mukhtar to Professor, related to my role in Golkar as Women Empowerment Issue Department, I guess. What are the best steps can be taken to play a role in G20? And also related to your interesting piece of thought about Jokowi's success. I guess the latter will be related to the women empowerment issues. Professor.
Well, I think the good news for the world is that in most parts of the world, the participation of women in the workforce, the participation of women in leadership positions is growing, and Indonesia is fortunate that it has always had very good women ministers. I mean, your finance minister, Sri Mulyani, is very highly respected around the world. Your foreign minister, Retno Marsudi, is also highly respected around the world. And, you know, many of your former ministers were also highly regarded around the world. So I think in the case of Indonesia, you have from time to time produced good female leaders. But I think obviously every country needs to have more participation of women in the workforce and in leadership positions. And I would make the point, and this is a hotly debated point. But I would make the point that the world would be a more peaceful place if women are more involved in decision making, because women are more conscious of the impact of the decisions that we make on families and what happens to them. Certainly on climate change, many women, those women who give birth to children nowadays, worry about how climate change is going to affect their children. So clearly, I would say that the more you can have the involvement of women in leadership positions, the better it would be.
Very well. Okay, Professor Kishore, we are getting towards the end of the session. Before we take a photo op with you, I would like to have the last question from you related to your article about Jokowi. So, since I'm a journalist, I have a trait to be pessimistic, yeah? So, and your article was viral for two reasons. People agree or disagree, right? And we see that the president's approval rating has went down because of COVID, and also we see that the president rarely appear at international events. Say like the UNGA meetings. The president never been there physically in New York to deliver a speech representing the country. With the role Indonesia as president of G20, how can we be relevant where Jokowi has always been heavily focused on domestic issue? What is like the global perspective of him that we don't know as Indonesian?
Well, I think it's a very good that President Jokowi didn't travel overseas, didn't go around attending a lot of international meetings in his early years. I think it was very wise of him to focus on domestic development and on building infrastructure in Indonesia, reducing poverty in Indonesia, reforming the labor laws in Indonesia, laying the groundwork for foreign investors to come to Indonesia. I think he did all the right things. He laid the foundations in his early years. But now that he's in his second term, and now that he's had a very strong domestic record, he's in a good position now to participate in international leadership ventures like the G20. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that my article went viral in Indonesia because people agreed with it and disagreed with it. And I was actually very happy that many people disagreed with it, because the fact that people could disagree with it showed that Indonesia is today quite a vibrant democracy, that you have many different schools of thought, many different points of view. So that disagreement, I don't see that as a bad sign. I see that as a good sign. And frankly, I think the point, one key point I want to emphasize to an Indonesian audience is that why don't you go around, if you can, visit other countries which have populations, large populations, as large as Indonesia. Why don't you go and visit maybe Brazil, maybe Nigeria, and see the situation in these other countries. And in these countries, the people don't feel a sense of hope for the future in the same way that the Indonesians feel today, right? And you benefited from a leader whose only focus was on improving the condition of his people. And I saw this in my own eyes when President Jokowi was governor of Indonesia. I spent one day with him in December 2013, traveling with him and seeing his common touch and seeing how he was very concerned about getting things done, and so that is a tremendous asset that you have in your current president. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that one reason why Indonesian democracy is successful is also because he was preceded by President SBY, who laid the foundations for Indonesian democracy in many ways by being so open-minded to different points of view, right? And being very open and willing to engage the world also. So it's through a cumulative process, Indonesia, have arrived, relatively speaking, at a happy destination. And frankly, I don't want to mention any of our fellow ASEAN countries, but just even look around ASEAN. Look around how troubled some of your neighbors are today, right? I mean, there are incredible leadership contests in your neighboring ASEAN countries also. So if you just compare Indonesia either with countries of the same size or even with countries in this region, Indonesia has done a far better job, I would say, over the last 10, 20 years than most countries in the world has. And you should celebrate what you have achieved, but of course, don't be satisfied. Build on what you have achieved and make it better from now on. But realize that it's actually very, very difficult to achieve what Indonesia has achieved so far. And because you have such a good, strong track record, you have the authority, the credibility to become a leader of G20. So if your country is in bad shape, you cannot become a good leader of G20. You cannot, because everybody is saying, oh, come on, they cannot even take care of the country. How can they run the G20? But Indonesia can say, we have taken very good care of our country. We have one of the best development records. We have one of the best democracies. And that gives you the credibility to provide the leadership to G20. And in many ways, the style of President Jokowi, which is understated, which is low-key, is exactly what is needed when you're dealing with these very, very loud, I call them elephants, but in some ways they're like loud tigers, you know, China and United States. The quiet, understated leadership of President Jokowi could help to calm down these raging elephants and tell them, hey, calm down, we got more important things to do. And that's why I am actually optimistic that Indonesian can provide good leadership of G20, and I'm confident that Indonesia's leadership of G20 will be a success.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, thank you very much, Professor, for your insights, for your time, for sharing with us. We'd like to have the opportunity to take a picture with you. So, jadi kita mau foto dulu bersama. Silakan, boleh diatur, Mas Mulya. Silakan teman-teman yang di sayap kanan saya, silakan bergabung ke sini, kita akan foto bareng. As a good Indonesian, we need to take a picture, Professor.
Yes.
Ya, silakan lebih cepat teman-teman, cari tempat untuk bisa muat semuanya di dalam frame-nya. Silakan. Oke, kalau sudah siap, masuk aja Mas, silakan. Silakan cue-nya dari fotografer ya. Dihitung ya Mas, dihitung Pak fotografer. 3, 2, 1. Satu lagi. Thumbs up. Now video. Ya.
Golkar Institute maju bertransformasi. Golkar Institute maju bertransformasi.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Kishore. Thank you very much for joining us and have a good rest. Teman-teman, terima kasih banyak kepada Dewan Penasehat Golkar Institute, terima kasih banyak atas acara yang sangat insightful ini. Semoga lebih banyak lagi acara-acara seperti ini. Terima kasih teman-teman. Terima kasih teman-teman di Zoom atas partisipasinya.
Teman-teman, tertib dulu teman-teman. Sorry Pak, teman-teman sabar dulu Mbak. Nanti satu persatu akan dapat sesi foto. Ya, satu persatu. Ya, satu orang. Satu persatu. Satu-satu. Silakan. Silakan Pak Firly. Sabar ya. Jangan halangin pintu ya. Sabar. Bu Jen, abis ini Bu Jen, sini Bu Jen. Yuk, langsung. Sabar Bang, tahan dulu Bang. Sini Bang.